I never believed much in the paranormal, but that was before I stumbled upon a subreddit dedicated to true horror stories. At first, it was just a way to pass time, reading through the chilling tales that users posted late at night. I would sit, laptop aglow, wrapped in the safety of my dimly lit living room, convincing myself it was all just fiction. One evening, as rain pattered softly against my windows, I found a thread that caught my eye. It wasn't like the others. There was an air of urgency in the user's tone, a palpable fear that seemed to leap off the screen. The post was a call for help, claiming that something from the stories had followed them into the real world. I scoffed, amused and intrigued, and typed a skeptical comment asking for more details. The response came quicker than I expected. "It's no joke," the user replied, their words a rapid clack of keys in the quiet of my room. "Once you notice them, they notice you. Don't dig too deep, or you might not like what finds you." I laughed it off, my fingers already scrolling to the next eerie tale, the warning forgotten as soon as it was read. That night, I went to bed with my mind swirling with images of shadowy figures and whispered threats. Sleep, however, proved elusive. Every small noise was a footstep, every shadow a lurking figure. Just as I began to drift off, a loud bang jolted me awake. Heart pounding, I chalked it up to the wind, or the house settling, or any of the logical explanations that daytime brings easily to mind. Over the next few days, odd occurrences began to pile up. My keys would vanish, only to reappear in places I'd never put them. Lights flickered without cause, and my TV would turn on to static in the dead of night. Rational explanations became harder to come by, but still, I clung to them, desperate to avoid facing the alternative. It wasn't until I saw the figure that denial became impossible. It was just a glimpse at first, a dark silhouette in the corner of my vision. But each time I saw it, it was closer, more distinct. Its features were blurry, indistinct, yet overwhelmingly sinister. And the eyes, if you could call them that, were hollows that seemed to pierce right through me. I tried to tell myself it was just stress or lack of sleep, but the encounters grew more frequent, more terrifying. I would wake up to find it at the foot of my bed, watching, waiting. When I spoke of it, my voice would catch, the words sounding ridiculous even to my own ears. No one believed me, their skeptical frowns making me feel even more isolated. As the apparition began to invade my days as well as my nights, I started searching for answers. I returned to the subreddit, my posts becoming increasingly frantic. Responses varied from skeptical to sympathetic, but one stood out. It was from the same user who had warned me initially. Their words were a cold comfort: "You've seen it, so it's seen you. There's no going back now." The advice was cryptic, the solutions offered ranging from the bizarre to the dangerous. One suggested an old ritual said to ward off unwanted attention from otherworldly beings. Desperate, I gathered the necessary items, each one more peculiar than the last: a mirror from a house where no one lived, salt from a dead sea, a candle made of beeswax from a hive that survived the winter. On the night of the full moon, I set everything up, the instructions detailed and specific. The air was thick with the scent of sage as I recited the words, the candle's flame flickering in the darkness. Shadows danced on the walls, and for a moment I thought I saw the figure, its form clearer than ever. My heart raced, the words catching in my throat, but I pushed through, desperate to be rid of the nightmare. The ritual complete, the room felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. I allowed myself to breathe, to hope. But as I turned to extinguish the candle, a cold hand gripped my shoulder, its touch ice. The figure stood before me, not banished, but enraged. Its face, once blurred, now sharpened into something horrific, its eyes a void that pulled at my soul. I stumbled back, words of another chant on my lips, but the figure advanced. The room grew colder, the shadows darker, and I knew then that I had not ended the nightmare, but only angered it. The figure's voice was a whisper, but it filled the room, chilling and sharp as it spoke. You cannot unsee what has been seen, cannot unknow what is known. We are linked, you and I, forever bound by sight. My breath fogged in the air as I backed away, the figure's form never wavering. It was then I realized the true horror was not in being haunted by some specter, but in knowing it would never end, that each day would be a battle, each night a terror. I reached for the laptop, the screen now a gateway to my doom, and began typing, a warning to others, my story a beacon and a curse. The keys clacked under my fingers as I wrote, the figure watching, always watching. I left my story unfinished, a thread dangling in the dark web of fear, hoping someone would read, understand, and perhaps find a way to end what I could not. The figure's hollow eyes watched as I posted, its whisper echoing in my mind, share the fear, spread the dread, and maybe you'll find peace in the company of the damned. As I clicked submit, the room dimmed, the figure's outline blurring into the shadows once more, a presence felt but unseen, waiting for its next victim to read, to see, to believe. The screen flickered, the cursor blinking in the dim light, a silent sentinel in the never-ending saga of horror. The blinking cursor seemed to mock me, a beacon in the growing darkness of my room. It was as if each click was a heartbeat, growing louder, more insistent. I could feel it, the oppressive presence of the figure, hovering just beyond the light of my screen. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes that flickered at the edge of my vision. That night, sleep eluded me entirely. My mind replayed every encounter, each one more terrifying than the last. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, where darkness pooled like ink. The air grew stifling, thick with unspoken words. Then, the silence was broken by a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood, coming from the foot of my bed. I froze, breath caught in my throat as the sound grew louder, more desperate. With a courage I didn't feel, I turned on the bedside lamp. The light flickered, weak against the darkness. At the foot of my bed, the figure loomed, its form clearer than ever. It was a ghastly sight, its skin pale and translucent, eyes deep black wells of nothingness. You cannot hide, it hissed, its voice a mix of anger and delight. You cannot forget. I scrambled back against the headboard, my heart pounding in my ears. The figure moved closer, its movements jerky, like a marionette pulled by unseen strings. I could see now that its lips were moving rapidly, whispering words I couldn't quite catch. The air around it seemed to shimmer, a visual static that made my eyes water. Desperate, I reached for my phone, thinking to capture this nightmare, to prove it wasn't all in my head. But as I aimed the camera, the figure vanished, leaving behind a cold spot and the faint smell of decay. The screen showed nothing but the empty room, the normalcy of it a stark contrast to my racing pulse. Days passed, each more harrowing than the last. My home no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a prison. The figure was everywhere and nowhere, its presence constant but unseen. Objects moved, strange marks appeared on the walls, and the air was often filled with the sound of whispering, too low to make out. I turned to the internet, to that cursed subreddit, searching for anyone who had experienced anything similar. My posts became more frantic, the responses more scattered. Some users offered sympathy, others advice, but none of it seemed to matter. The figure was a part of my life now, an unwelcome shadow that never quite receded. One user, however, seemed to know more than most. Their messages were cryptic, filled with warnings and talk of a curse. "You've opened a door you cannot close," they wrote. You've invited it in, and now it will not leave until it has what it wants. What does it want? I typed back, my hands shaking as I awaited the reply. The answer was a long time coming, hours that stretched into days. When it finally came, it chilled me to the bone. It wants your fear, the message read. Your fear sustains it, feeds it. It will grow stronger with every fright, every moment of terror you feel. I read the words over and over, a growing sense of doom enveloping me. If my fear was feeding it, how could I possibly escape? I needed help, but who could I turn to? Who would believe such a fantastic tale? It was then I decided to contact a medium, someone versed in the supernatural. Perhaps they could offer some form of aid. I found one with good reviews and, desperate, made an appointment. The day of the meeting, I felt a mix of hope and fear, a tumultuous blend that kept my nerves on edge. The medium was an older woman, her eyes sharp and knowing. She listened as I recounted my story, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, her fingers tapping on the table. Finally, she spoke, her voice grave. You are haunted by a revenant, a spirit that feeds on fear. It is attached to you because you have seen it, acknowledged it. This acknowledgement gives it power. My stomach dropped, the finality of her words a heavy weight. Is there no way to be rid of it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. There may be one way, she said slowly, but it comes with great risk. You must confront it, deny it the fear it craves. Only then will it weaken, perhaps enough to break its hold on you. The idea of confronting the figure was terrifying. Every encounter had left me more drained, more frightened. Yet, what choice did I have? Living like this was no life at all, each day a test of my sanity. I left the medium's place with a plan forming, however shaky it might be. That night, I prepared, mentally and physically, for the confrontation. I gathered items that I thought might offer protection, a salt circle, a silver knife, and a crucifix. I wasn't sure if any of it would help, but I had to try something, anything. As darkness fell, I sat in the center of the salt circle, the items arrayed around me. I waited, my heart pounding, as the shadows grew longer, deeper. The air grew colder, the atmosphere charged with an electric tension. And then it appeared, the figure, its eyes darker, its smile more sinister. It approached the circle, its gaze fixed on me. You cannot win, it whispered, the sound like the rustle of dry leaves. I will always be here, watching, waiting. But this time, I was ready. No, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. I am not afraid of you. The words were a lie, but I held on to them like a lifeline, repeating them over and over in my mind. The figure paused, its smile faltering. You will be, it said, but there was a note of uncertainty in its voice, a crack in the facade. I held my ground, repeating my mantra, I am not afraid. The figure wavered, its form flickering like a bad television signal. It let out a shriek, a sound so terrible it seemed to shake the very walls. But I did not look away, did not flinch. I watched as it faded, the scream dwindling to a whisper, then nothing at all. The room was silent, the tension broken. I dared to breathe, to hope. Yet, as I looked around, the relief was short-lived. The shadows seemed to pulse, a reminder that it was not gone, just retreated. I knew then that this was not the end, that the battle was only just beginning. The figure would return, perhaps in another form, another time. But I would be ready, or so I hoped. The night grew deeper, the darkness a cloak that hid the unknown. I remained in the circle, wary and watchful, knowing that the next encounter was just a matter of time. The fight had only just begun, and I was in it for the long haul. The screen of my laptop glowed in the dim light, a silent sentinel as I began to type once more, sharing my story, warning others. The cursor blinked, a steady rhythm in the quiet, a beat in the darkness, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The night lingered on, each moment stretched thin by tension and fear. After my encounter, a fragile silence enveloped the house, as if even the walls held their breath. I sat still, the salt circle around me a meager fortress against the shadows that seemed to press closer with each passing hour. My laptop screen was the only light, casting eerie shadows that danced just out of sight. Just when I thought perhaps the worst was over, a low moan echoed through the room. It was soft at first, barely audible over the hum of my computer, but it grew louder, more insistent. I tensed, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a ghostly wail that chilled my blood. Suddenly, the air grew icy cold, and I saw my breath fog before me. The moaning stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so deep it roared in my ears. Then, the figure appeared, not in the shadows this time, but right before me, across the boundary of the salt circle. It was clearer now, more solid than it had ever been, its eyes pools of black despair, its mouth twisted in a grotesque parody of a grin. "You think you can banish me so easily?" it hissed, its voice a serpentine whisper that slithered into my ears. "I am bound to you, a part of you now." I swallowed hard, trying to muster my courage. "I am not afraid," I repeated, though my voice shook. It felt like a thin shield against a mighty wind. The figure laughed, a sound that was both horrifying and sad. "But you are, I can taste it. Your fear is delicious." As it spoke, it moved closer, the salt line that I had drawn seeming to mean nothing. Desperate, I clutched the silver knife I had placed beside me, though I doubted its usefulness against such an entity. The figure's laughter echoed through the stillness, chilling and unrelenting. Its form began to shimmer, blurring like a mirage under a desert sun. Despite my fear, I raised the knife, my grip trembling. "This ends tonight," I declared, my voice steadier than I felt. As if in response, the figure solidified, its features becoming grotesquely clear. "So be it," it whispered, a smile playing across its lips. Suddenly, it lunged forward, breaking the invisible barrier of the salt circle with a force that sent a shockwave through the room. The windows rattled, and the lamp flickered wildly. I braced myself, expecting an icy touch or a searing pain, but instead, the figure halted just inches away, its face contorting in confusion. It reached out, its hand stopping as if blocked by an unseen wall. The silver knife in my hand glowed softly, a warm light that grew brighter with each passing second. "You cannot touch me," I said, realizing the power the silver knife wielded. The warmth from the knife spread through my body, emboldening me. "You have no power here anymore." The figure recoiled, its form beginning to dissolve into the air. "This is not over," it hissed, but its voice was fading, losing strength. "I banish you," I said firmly, standing my ground. "Return to the shadows from whence you came. You are not welcome in my life, not now, not ever." With those words, a surge of energy rushed from the knife, enveloping the room in a blinding light. The figure screamed, a sound so terrible it seemed to split the very air. And then, just as quickly as it had escalated, the room fell silent. The light dimmed, and I was alone, the figure gone as if it had never been. I dropped to my knees, the knife clattering to the floor. My breaths came in ragged gasps, relief and disbelief mingling in my chest. The salt circle remained intact, a reminder of the night's reality, not just a figment of my imagination. Days turned into weeks, and the peace remained unbroken. The shadows in my home seemed just that, shadows, not hiding places for specters. My sleep was deep and undisturbed, the nightmares that had plagued me gone as if washed away by the light that had banished my tormentor. I shared my final encounter on the subreddit, a detailed account of the confrontation and the apparent victory. Responses poured in, some skeptical, others congratulatory, but all curious about the silver knife and its mysterious power. I could only tell them what I knew, that it was a family heirloom, perhaps imbued with some ancient strength unknown to me. As I typed the last words of my story, I felt a closure I hadn't dared to hope for. The laptop screen glowed warmly against the twilight that crept through my window, a stark contrast to the darkness that had once dominated my nights. The figure never returned. Whether it was truly banished or simply lying in wait, I could not say. But one thing was clear, I was no longer a prisoner in my own home, haunted by the unseen and the unknown. I had faced my fear, and though the battle had been terrifying, it had also brought a new strength. I looked around my quiet, peaceful room, a soft smile playing on my lips. The horror that had once seemed endless was now just a memory, a dark chapter concluded by the light of courage and the glow of silver. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the floor, I knew that whatever lay in those shadows was just part of the world, not a doorway to dread. And with that final thought, I closed my laptop. The chapter truly ended, the story complete. No more fear, no more shadows. Just the calm, comforting silence of a life reclaimed.